Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot tell you how pleased I am to be standing here telling you that we finally have a budget-friendly graphics card that costs $299, not $1,600. Actually, this is cheaper than the previous generation, yet the performance should be much higher and make this perfect for 1080p and even a light bit of 1440. Let's whack this straight under the overhead and take a look then. And here we go. We have a baby little AMD graphics card. I mean, the build quality of this is still top-notch. I think you probably will be able to get other cards that will end up being a little bit cheaper in the long run, but AMD are actually going to be selling this, which is pretty cool. So this is the 7600, and the main things you need to know about this is that it has 8GB of VRAM, which personally I think for $300 should be okay, as long as you're aware of the limitations that we'll be discussing pretty much throughout this video. But then in terms of performance, especially if you're playing multiplayer titles at 1080p and even 1440p, I think you're pretty much looking at 100 FPS or higher in most things. I'm really hoping in Apex Legends we can actually hit that 200 FPS mark. That'd be pretty darn cool. But of course, the only way to actually know for sure is to do ourselves a little PC build. This is all going to be geared around a budget-friendly build, and as always, we're going to show you all the components that you need to build yourself a kick-ass gaming PC for less. We'll be showing you what's hot, what's maybe not so great, and of course show you those all-important gameplay benchmark numbers so you know exactly how this thing performs. So let's see if budget-friendly PC gaming has finally caught itself a break. Right after a short word from this video sponsor. Introducing Sky Protect. Sky Protect is a smart new way to protect the home you love. Sky Protect blends together home insurance with smart tech that lets you keep an eye on things when out and about for complete peace of mind. You get a video doorbell, indoor camera, leak sensors and security sensors all included, designed to stop small problems becoming big ones. Learn more about what Sky Protect can do for you today with the link down below. And at this point, I've pretty much already showed you everything you need to know about the 7600. This is a dual fan card. I imagine most of the ones that you'll be buying from third parties will as well. We don't have any of this new fancy 12-pin high power connection. This is a single 8-pin. But a nice little surprise that I will draw your attention to is that this card does actually support DisplayPort 2.1, which means if you want to buy one of these super fancy high-end monitors that have massive resolution and massive refresh rate, this will be able to drive it, but not literally in terms of frame rates. I think that's probably quite unlikely. And I think I'm going to try and do this build as quickly as possible whilst giving you all the information along the way, because I know loads of you are itching to actually see how this thing performs. And the motherboard that we're using here today is actually Intel. This is the B760 Tomahawk Wi-Fi DDR4. Catchy long name, but as the name I suppose suggests, this is a DDR4 motherboard, so it's going to save you some money. But fundamentally, this is the latest generation where we can use it with a 13th gen chip without the need for a BIOS update. And then in terms of I/O, you pretty much got everything that you could want. Loads of USB Type A, a single Type C, and then Wi-Fi, which is going to be useful if you don't sort of, I was going to say live near. Technically, do we live in our man or woman caves? This is going into a weird place. Basically, it's got Wi-Fi built into the board. That's it. End of the video. PC Centric is cancelled. Coming up next on PC Centric, how to plant sunflowers. Get your garden looking brilliant this summer. Oh, okay. Maybe I should spend less time joking around and more time actually doing my job. This has PCI Gen 5 on this top socket as well, so if you do want to upgrade this a little bit later down the line with a, I suppose the equivalent of this really, which would be like a 4 or 5 years graphics card from now that uses PCI Gen 5 on 8X lane, you could put it in this and you wouldn't be losing out on speed. The CPU that we're using is the definition of mid-range, mid-tier. This is the 13400F, and this is a fair bit better than the 12400F. It's not like night and day, but especially if you're going to play something like Warzone, I would expect you to get maybe 10 to 20 FPS more just by going for this versus the 12400F. But then again, this is around about 40–50 pounds more than that CPU. So if you're not too fussed or you're not playing games that will be massively CPU limited, you can save some money and get that. But for today, when we're using a brand new graphics card, the last thing we really want is our CPU to hold us back. So let's pop this 6-core chip into place. We're of course also going to need some RAM, and this is a more budget-friendly RGB kit. This is the D45G. This runs at 3600 megahertz, which of course isn't anywhere near as fast as you can get from DDR5, but as we recently tested in our video, there isn't actually any real difference at the moment between DDR4 and DDR5 at this sort of level. If you want to check that video out, you can find it in the top right corner of your screen. And besides, whilst things are definitely improving with DDR5 prices, DDR4 is definitely still a fair bit less. Now let's have ourselves a little tidy up and move on to our next component. And this is the SSD, this is the NM620 from Lexar. And the reason that we're using this is because it's consistently a pretty cheap, budget-friendly drive. The read speeds aren't particularly crazy, it's Gen 3, not Gen 4. But realistically, as long as you can get this for a good price, it's going to be perfect really for the sort of components that we're using. However, having said that, there are always loads of good deals to be found on SSDs. And I'm always very reluctant to say you must use this particular one because that's just not the case at all. If you can find an even faster drive on sale for less money, then clearly that's going to be the way to go. So you do need to be a little bit more of a savvy shopper to get the best deal. But let's remove our top cover, whack in our SSD, remove this little cover, then just drop this back and screw it down. Now at this point we are pretty much ready to put this in our chassis, but we are going to go for a brand new cooler actually. This is the Hyper 212 Halo, and Cooler Master are always upgrading this to something anyway. I wouldn't necessarily say that you have to go for this one, because again, coolers tend to go on sale. There are good ones from Be Quiet, Arctic Cooling, things like that. But the Hyper 212 is and probably always will be a fan favorite, especially at this sort of level. Fundamentally, it's going to be a whole lot quieter than the Intel stock cooler that I would recommend you use if you're trying to save every buck, but eventually stepping up to something like this will just give you a much nicer PC gaming experience. Unless you use headphones, then who cares?
Oh, I care actually!
I'm just making a point, leave me alone. I'll tell you what though, I absolutely love the design of this. I mean, it perfectly matches our AMD graphics card. It's almost as if I planned this. I didn't. I mean, technically I did, but I mean, I didn't know they were gonna look exactly the same. Let's get our Intel backplate, feed this around the back of the board. Then you can awkwardly slide it back into place. Grab our little screws and our thermal compound. Grab the Intel brackets and just gently lower that on top of the cooler and then screw into place from the underside. This is something that used to catch me out all the time. I was wondering why it wouldn't screw in because I was trying to do it the wrong way round. A good old squeeze of lube. Pull out all of the pins and then just gently lower this on top. And then screw down gently in a diagonal pattern so you're not putting too much pressure on the CPU socket. Then you can grab and fit these little coat hangers to the fan and then gently place this on top of the cooler and clip it into place. And that is just so much easier than fitting a radiator. As we know on this channel,
I hate radiators.
I do, I genuinely do. I've got a leak in my house as well, and apparently it's the radiator. You couldn't make this up. The fan comes with two cables to plug in. We've got one for addressable RGB. Then you've also got this little 4-pin for power. Plug this into one that says CPU fan. And believe it or not, at this stage, we're actually almost there. We just need to get this inside our chassis and plug in our power supply and graphics card. And the case that we're using here, I'm already a little unsure about. This is from Antec, and this is even cheaper than the cheap case we used last time. This is the AX61, and this definitely looks to be a very, very budget-friendly case. This is essentially about as cheap as you can go, but they fit it with 4 RGB fans. So it's not going to be the absolute cheapest you can find, but then you don't need to add any fans to it. And I think the fans that you do get, actually, the Antec ones, tend to be okay. There's not really any reason to upgrade them or anything anytime soon, but I mean, just look how flimsy that is. Don't sit on it. But obviously, if you're trying to save money, this is a pretty solid way to do it, really, because once you've got everything built up, it gives it a lot more strength and rigidity. It's just things like lack of cable management grommets and things we all have to be aware of, but there is quite a lot of room down the side here, nice little channel, so I think you can get everything neat. Just don't overload this with loads and loads of things. But I mean, to be fair, you could put a radiator at the front up to a 360, so for the money, it's not too bad. Just be aware if you want better build quality, you'll have to sort of look elsewhere or obviously spend more money. Let's pick up our motherboard. IO shield is already attached to this board, so we don't have to worry about pre-fitting that. Oh, actually, I'm lying. The standoffs aren't all in the board. Ugh. Let's go around the back then and grab our standoffs. Wow, only 2 cable ties. Is that honestly all you could afford to put in the box? 2. When have you ever seen just 2 cable ties? I'm actually blown away. This is next level. While I think about it as well, I will also take off the PCIe slot covers for slots 2 and 3, because it is a lot safer to do this before you put your motherboard in. But then we can put this back down, add in our standoffs wherever it says A, and then second time lucky, let's grab our motherboard, skirt the meandering fan cables, get that lined up, and then fit it down. Right, let's see what this has done to the structure and rigidity. That makes quite a big difference as expected. We do need to grab all of the cables around the back. They always look a little bit intimidating, but they are actually quite easy to fit in. They're usually labeled as well if they look a little bit odd. reset switch. Why is that there? Oh, it wants you to plug the reset switch in. Okay. Then you've got your SATA, your fan extensions, which I guess just plug in up here at the top. Our USB 3 plugs in just here. USB is down here at the bottom. And then next to that, you've got your HD audio, which is in this bottom left-hand corner. I think at this point, I'm gonna have to use one of my cable ties. I know some of you will think this is a bit of a wild move, but I just can't wait. And then we've also got our front panel connections, which on MSI board says JFP1. Power switch is the top right of that. Bottom left is HD LED. Then above that, you've got your power LEDs, positive on the left, negative on the right. And then here comes the moment that you guys have been waiting for. The time to actually grab our RX 7600 and line it up with a slot and actually get this in our gaming PC. Always a good noise. Let's drop this in till we get a nice click. There we go. Fix it down with a couple of screws. And then you could admire just how tiny this is. I don't know, it almost feels as if we need an extra fan on the other side. Purely just because we've got this weird sort of gap there. I'm not used to having such an open PC and such a small enclosure. Like, yes, if you're using a massive one, I get it. But when was the last time we did a build in a small enclosure and had this much space? Just one more component to go then, and this is our power supply. This is a 550 watt unit. It's the Pure Power 11 FM from Be Quiet, and Be Quiet power supplies, in my experience, have always proved to be very reliable. They're not always the absolute cheapest, but they're also very quiet, and this is a modular one as well, so it's something you'll be able to keep for a long time. If you know you're going to upgrade to a more expensive GPU later down the line, it does make sense to grab like a 650 that gives you more headroom, but 550 for this should be absolutely fine. Just plug in all of the connections that you're going to need, which is your motherboard, CPU, one SATA and one PCIe. Installing it is simple. Just grab your power supply and just gently push it in down the bottom. He says, realizing that there's a hard drive cage right in the way. I mean, you'd have to have a pretty small power supply for this not to be in the way. You can move it across to the left, but then you can't use a 360 radiator. Well, I've moved that over. Let's see if it will fit in now. Yeah, there you go. Then you can just screw that in. Then it's just a case of plugging everything in, starting with this large ATX. Use the left CPU connection at the top of the board. Feed the PCIe down at the bottom. Clip that together and then poke it into the GPU. And then I think finally, we just need to plug our RGB fans in. And this is a bit of a weird one because it's almost like it's got an internal hub somehow. There's no hub, but they all daisy chain together, but not with addressable RGB. It's weird. But just grab the SATA, plug this in, and then you have one addressable RGB header on the other side of the board. Plug the fan into that, and then we're done. And I mean, to be fair, you probably can get away with just 2 cable ties, but it's suboptimal, isn't it? But anyway, this is not the video to get all finickety. This is all about this thing. And impressions so far are, I guess, pretty good, but other than the fact that it looks nice, it's future-proof with DisplayPort 2.1, it's not going to have enough VRAM to run every game at ultra settings, but it's probably not that powerful anyway. There's not really much we can say until we get this thing turned on and get testing. Right then, let's get this thing turned on and ready to go after promoting the PC Centric mouse mat. Link to this is down below. Grab yours today. Let's hope this works and that it works well. Would help if I turned on the power switch. Oh, that delay was horrible. That delay was horrible. Okay, and straight off the bat, that is a very attractive gaming PC. I think my opinion on this case has actually changed throughout this video. It's been getting progressively better because as long as you are okay with sort of no frills, not really the best build quality in the world, you do get everything that you need, don't you? It's not going to support extra large graphics cards or loads of radiators and things, but actually, if you don't mind that, I'm quite impressed. We did it. Is this a clean install? It's almost like it's a pre-built. I've faked this whole thing. All right then, it looks as if I'm setting up a new copy of Windows. If you don't already have this preloaded, which you almost certainly won't, just grab a USB flash drive, go to the Windows website, download it, whack it in the back of your PC, restart, and it essentially comes up with a similar screen to this. Follow the instructions. You will also need to enable XMP and make your fans as quiet as possible in the BIOS, but otherwise that's pretty much all you need to do until you're in Windows and obviously install your drivers and get going. So give me a couple of hours to get all of this done, and we'll be right back with the benchmarks. And just like that, we are all set up and ready to go. And I've now realized that actually the fans don't have any fan control for the case, which isn't as bad as you might think, because for gaming, you've sort of got them at the level that you'd want anyway, but it's very off-putting to not have any control at all. If you want to use your PC when you're in your desktop, they're making a bit of noise. It's annoying. But anyway, let's jump into the performance. And to kick us off, we're going to start with some multiplayer titles, and this is Fortnite. And as you can see, we're going to test a very unrealistic resolution of 4K and work our way down. Everything else is set to high settings, no ray tracing, nanite or anything, but I have turned temporal super resolution to quality and 66%. As we descend down from the mighty battle bus, you're probably thinking, 4K? Really? On a budget-friendly GPU? This seems a little bit ridiculous. Why would you do that? Well, immediately, we're currently getting around about 50 to 60 FPS, which is actually a fair bit more than I thought. But realistically, I guess I want to see how this performs at all the different resolutions, but fundamentally as well, to check out this figure in the top left-hand corner of your screen, the memory, because the higher you push the resolution, the more VRAM you're going to use. And Fortnite clearly doesn't look to be a title where you're going to be running into too many issues. This is high settings, but running at 4K with the upscaling, 6.5 gigabytes, not too bad at all. But that's 4K anyway. Let's go into the settings and turn this down to something that I think a lot of people probably would want to try and play at, 1440p. And as we start the recording once again, you can immediately see the difference that it does have on the VRAM. We're using around about a gigabyte less. But in terms of the frame rate, we've pretty much doubled it, now around about 120 frames a second, which for a card that is geared, I guess, for 1080p gaming, at high settings, it goes to show that even if you are going to get a higher end monitor, that's personally what I would pick, like a 165Hz 1440p display, you're still going to be able to drive it in games like Fortnite. And I think for most people with cards like this is the sort of gaming you're actually going to be doing on it. So while we will get to some of the doom and gloom around 8 gigabytes of VRAM on all of these new cards, fundamentally most gaming that most people are going to do on these is actually going to sort of exceed your expectations. Taking this resolution test to its logical conclusion, now we have 1080p, and our frame rate has of course increased again, actually about another 50 to 60 FPS. It's kind of weirdly linear this time. But the VRAM hasn't actually changed drastically. I think we're using about 300 meg less, but when you're getting around about 160 frames a second, again, this is going to be a perfect GPU if you are wanting to play competitive games at high settings, at frame rates that are actually pretty darn high. Next, title. Oh no, actually wait, we haven't done the peel. I'm getting better at this. Let's press on now to our next multiplayer game. This is some Call of Duty Warzone 2, and we're going to set this again at 4K and work our way down. Let's go over to quality, set it to be ultra, turn on FSR 2.1, and here we are, jumping out of the plane, descending towards another island. I'm sensing a trend here, and this is not really a particularly playable experience. I mean, okay, that's a bit harsh. You could play it at 4K, but there's literally no reason to do it on this card whatsoever. The VRAM allocation is currently sitting at around about 7,800, so it's probably about okay, but it's borderline. I know this isn't a 4K GPU, and I do want to ram that point home, but we've got to test everything, so here's Warzone 2 at 4K. But anyway, that's pretty unimportant. Let's move this down to 1440 and actually test this for real. And sure enough, as you'd expect, the frame rate is a whole lot higher. We're now currently sitting at around about 100 frames a second or so. It does dip down into the very high 80s, but then it also peaks in the 120s. So I would say overall this isn't a bad experience. Our VRAM usage is still a little bit on the high side, so I would actually advise turning some of the settings down to high just to give yourself a little bit more headroom and, to be honest, a higher frame rate as well. And what you're seeing now is the exact same settings as before, except that FSR has been disabled, because personally, even FSR 2.1 I'm still not a fan of at 1080p. Higher resolutions, it's fine, but I think it is a little bit noticeable, especially in Warzone. But let's move on now to a single player title, some heavier things. And let's start with a game I really enjoyed playing, despite the stutter, some Dead Space Remake. And we're not even gonna bother running this at 4K because we know we won't have enough VRAM for that. So we're gonna start with 1440. And in terms of settings, we've got variable rate shading enabled, FSR, we'll set this to quality again. And let's set this to the medium preset and go from there. I honestly don't know how this is going to perform. And in terms of our memory usage, it does actually look as if we have enough, 7,200, but when we started this game, as you saw, we were getting a load of, I say stutter, does it even count as that? More like static imagery, but it does seem to have fixed itself now at least. And it's very hard to say whether this is the card or the game, because I had loads of problems playing this with a 4090, but granted, I didn't really get anything quite that bad. But let's see what happens if we turn the quality settings up a little bit further. I mean, personally speaking, I think medium was probably about right if you're using a mouse and keyboard, because it was nice and smooth. But if we turn this up to high, what difference has that made? Not really anything to the frame rate, actually, which is surprising, but also quite nice. CPU is currently sitting at about 50 degrees, so no issues in terms of thermals or anything, and the VRAM has now jumped up to about 7200. I mean, have we got any room for further expansion? Well, let's try Ultra. Frame rate still staying fairly similar. The one thing I will say is that the game just doesn't look quite as sharp as I would like. It's properly FSR 2.1 onwards that I would say you get that level of fidelity that personally I'm looking for. So let's turn it back to TAA, and yeah, the frame rate has now plummeted down to about 45 frames a second, so not really where we'd want it to be, and to be honest, I think the VRAM utilization is probably at the limit now. However, turn it down to 1440p, still with FSR disabled, and immediately the game becomes a whole lot smoother. We're now looking at about 100, 110 FPS or so. So this is pretty much the thing with cards like this. If you're going to play it at 1080p at the settings that they sort of recommend, you'll probably find that you won't run into too many issues, if any at all. But there are going to be certain titles where 8 gig is going to limit you. But remember, unless it's a really unoptimized game, it should only be at the higher quality presets. As long as you're able to use a lower quality preset, 1080p should be fine. And 1440p gaming, especially in multiplayer, should be achievable. You're just going to find that there are going to be some limitations, but to be honest, there are always going to be limitations on a graphics card that is a little bit down the stack when it comes to pricing. But let's press on now to our third and final multiplayer title, another dropship. This is Apex Legends, and this is a game that actually runs at 4K without any real issues whatsoever. The frame rate always does increase ever so slightly as you hit the ground. This is Kings Canyon, and as you can clearly see, we're getting about 80 to 90 FPS on a budget-friendly GPU at 4K without any form of DLSS or upscaling technology, running at pretty much max settings, just one notch below. That is pretty darn impressive. Turning to the top left-hand corner of your screen though, you will see that the VRAM utilization is maxing this card out, but as someone that has played Apex Legends for literally years, personally, I think this is an example of a game that actually allocates the full amount of VRAM rather than one that actually needs all of it. I could be wrong here, but I'm not seeing any issues related to textures, stuttering, or anything other than just smooth gameplay. And I think this point is proven when we turn the settings down to 1440p, because as you can see, our frame rate has clearly increased. Now we're getting about 100 to 120 FPS, but that VRAM allocation hasn't really changed drastically. We're now looking at 7.5 gigabytes. On one hand, this is very impressive. 120 FPS at 1440p is more than most people really need to play competitively, and it will give you a very nice overall smooth and just generally nice experience. But then on the other, I guess it's kind of annoying that you're not getting that 160 that would properly saturate a monitor like this. But then again, this is a more entry-level GPU. However, I said at the start of this video that I was hoping that this is a GPU that could break the 200 FPS barrier in Apex Legends. And while I'm sorry that I've died and let the side down, you can clearly see that this is indeed a card that is actually capable of this. We're getting around about 200 FPS, maybe plus minus 10 or 20 in places at 1080p. So if you want to pair this with a high refresh rate monitor, you want to play ultra competitive settings in Apex Legends, then clearly this is a brilliant GPU to do it on. But let us now move on to our final game, and this is Hogwarts Legacy, and immediately the news is quite good because you can see our frame rate is around about 55 to 60 frames a second at the high preset running at FSR 4K. However, if you look at the ground, you will start to see that there are some texture streaming issues from time to time, where the whole game actually becomes pretty distracting because the textures are just missing, and that's pretty pointless really when you want the best overall experience. You want PC gaming to be a better than console experience, and obviously you're just not really going to be getting it. I mean, it is a bit of a weird one because if you look at the memory usage, it says it's only about 7,000 megabytes, but I'm not entirely convinced because all of these missing textures and things really shouldn't be like this. And it's not something that we saw in cards that have more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. But anyway, let's see if we can fix this by turning the resolution down to 1440p, because of course the lower resolution means we won't need as much VRAM. It's still allocating 7,000, now popped up to 7,500, and for the most part the issue does seem to have gone. I mean, There does seem to be the odd soft texture from here and there, but it's more of a texture streaming rate thing rather than necessarily running out of VRAM. Obviously the two things are related, but fundamentally we're not sort of stuck on missing or really low resolution textures anymore. We're getting maybe a little bit more pop in than we would like, but I, at the moment at least, wouldn't hesitate to use this. This would be absolutely fine. I wouldn't say that it's a game-breaking bug anymore. So 1440p gaming, just be aware of those potential texture issues. But let's try this one more time, this time at 1080p. And as you can see, our memory usage is now below 7,000, which is something I am pretty pleased to see. And it doesn't appear as if there's any form of texture streaming anymore, not at least at this part of the game. The frame rate as well is over 120 FPS now, so you can definitely have your cake and eat it when it comes to visuals, but there still is a little bit of stuttering from time to time, though I am recording this in AV1, which may explain why we're getting a little bit more hitching than I'd like. But generally speaking, it's a pretty cool experience. It's nice and smooth, and I would be very happy to play Hogwarts Legacy at these settings at 1080p on this system. So there we are then, our 7600 rig. Where does all of this leave us? Well, in terms of a system as a whole, I'd say it's fairly well balanced, but then more importantly really, when it comes to the GPU, the 7600, I do actually think it makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. Pretty much, if you're going to be playing multiplayer titles, you want as high a frame rate as possible. 1080p, even 1440p, something like Apex Legends, it's going to be perfect for that. But if you want something that's a lot more flexible and you want something that is definitely going to be able to play the latest titles for years to come with like maximum quality presets, realistically you have two options. You're going to have to look at something that is more expensive, probably an AMD card that's not released yet, or maybe the used market. You could get something like a 6700 XT for probably not that much more than that, and if it has similar if not slightly more performance and it's got more VRAM, I think that's probably the card you're going to have to stretch to, despite the fact it'll probably still cost you a fair bit more. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you make of our rig? What do you like about it? What do you make of the 7600? Will you be buying one? Let me know your thoughts down below. Smash the like button if you've enjoyed it. Get yourself subscribed. And of course, if you do want to check out current pricing on anything featured in this build, you can find it linked down below with my Amazon affiliate links. And while you're searching down there, why not check out Sky Protect? Sky Protect is a genius new way of protecting your home, combining exclusive smart home tech with home insurance. Security cameras and sensors can get very expensive, which is exactly why Sky bundle £250 worth of smart tech with Sky Protect home insurance. Perfect for keeping an eye on your home when you're away. Protect the things you love with Sky. Learn more with the link down below. But thank you so much for watching this video. We'll catch you in the next one.